Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the IEA World Energy Outlook. Many thanks to all of you for the interest in this webinar. We can see many people are online. I am Claudia Pavarini from the World Energy Outlook team, and I'm here with two of the lead authors of the World Energy Outlook, which was released on 13 November. I'm here with Tim Gould, which is the head of the Energy Supply and Investment Outlook Division at the IEA, and with Brent Warner, who is leading the modeling and the analysis of the power sector. This is the first in a series of webinars that we are doing for the World Energy Outlook 2018. Today's webinar will cover our key messages from the launch presentation, but we will also doing some specialized webinars on different aspects of the work. We can anticipate you some of those so that you can mark your calendars. The first one will be on the outlook of fuels on Friday, 23rd November. The second on the special focus on electricity on 26th November. And finally on the sustainable development scenario on Monday, 3rd December. The format you might already know. We have around 1 hour for the webinar, and we will go into dividing it into two phases. The first one, we will be showing our key findings, and then we will take the opportunity to answer your questions and as much as possible. Please feel free to submit all the questions at any point. We will go through the browser for the webinar. Of course, we will not be revealing the identity of the person unless you ask us specifically to. As already said, we will try to answer as many questions as possible live. In case we cannot manage to, we will try to get back to you via email. Also, slides and recording of the webinar will be available on our website after the event. And I think we can start. So I'll hand over to Tim Gould for the presentation.
Thanks very much, Claudia, and welcome to this webinar. I'm going to kick off by talking about some elements of today's energy context, and in particular, some mixed signals that we're getting from the latest market developments and the latest data about our starting point. First, in relation to oil markets, US shale very much at the center of attention, but there are uncertainties over geopolitics and Venezuela, some other issues. As our oil market report has noted, we've reached new twin peaks for demand and supply by straining parts of the system to the limit. And in our view, that does create a risk of volatility as we look forward. In gas markets, the mood has changed. It wasn't long ago the talk in the analytical community was about a gas glut, but consumers, led by China, have responded. Latest data from China for the first 3 quarters of this year, gas demand up by nearly 20% compared with 2017. And 2017 was already a very strong year. Imports up by double that. You may cast your mind back to 2004, 2005, when we started to see the China effect on oil markets. In our view, we're now seeing the China effect on gas. Solar PV is charging ahead, although not quite at the rate that we saw in 2017. Other technologies showing great promise include offshore wind, particularly in Europe, storage in other parts of the world. But overall, there are plenty of clean energy technologies that are lagging behind a bit. There are indications from our own analysis at the IEA that the flow of new energy efficiency policies may be slowing just at a moment when they need to pick up. 2017, the improvement in the world's energy intensity, the energy intensity of the global economy, the improvement in 2017 was the slowest we've seen this decade. A very important starting point, our assessment based on the latest data for 2018 is that emissions are continuing to rise. in our view, we're going to hit another historic high in 2018. This trajectory is far out of step with the early peak in emissions that scientific knowledge says will be essential to tackle climate change. There are some better news. As many of you are aware, we also track the population worldwide that doesn't have access to electricity. We think back to the year 2000, 1.7 billion worldwide. That had already fallen to around 1.4 billion in 2010. And for the first time since we started tracking this, the global population without access to electricity fell below 1 billion. Credit, among others, goes to India, but there's still an awful long way to go. But this good news on electricity raises a number of questions. Is electricity provided by increasingly cost-competitive renewables and linked to a range of digital technologies? Is that the answer to the world's energy dilemmas? It's a hot topic. It's the special focus of the WEO 2018. There are clearly huge opportunities. There are big questions, though, about how much of the world's demand can really be electrified. What do the power systems of the future look like? And those are areas that my colleague Brent Wanner is going to come back to a bit later on in this presentation. As ever, navigating a path through all of this uncertain territory requires a comprehensive look at the energy system, all fuels, all technologies, to understand different energy futures and how they come about. We have multiple scenarios and case studies in the World Energy Outlook, but we're really going to be focusing on two of the key scenarios here, which provide an overall framing of the directions that the energy system could take. The new policy scenario is designed as a way to assess the implications of the things that governments are already doing, but also the things that they say they would like to do, for instance, in their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. We can assess those implications also by comparing it with another scenario called the Sustainable Development Scenario, and that draws its inspiration from the UN Sustainable Development Goals, energy-related goals, three key ones that we focus on: universal access to electricity and clean cooking by 2030, a dramatic reduction in the pollutants that cause poor air quality around the world, and to get us onto a trajectory for emissions, for energy-related CO2 emissions, that's fully in line with the aims of the Paris Agreement. I'm going to say a few words now about where we're heading, so the outlook in our new policy scenario. And I'd like to start by going to the overall picture for energy demand and also rewinding the clock back to the year 2000. You can see from the screen that at that time, the United States, followed by the European Union, were the largest energy consumers worldwide. So this is a different energy world from the one that we have today. And the reason for that, if you keep your eyes on the progress over the years in energy demand, with China, massive expansion in energy consumption since 2000, overtaking the US as the world's largest energy consumer. But when we start looking forward, then structural changes in China's economy mean that this pace of growth slows to only a fraction of what we've had up until today. But now I'd invite you to keep your eyes on India as we wind forward, because India is the largest source of demand growth in our projections to 2040. And it overtakes Europe and then starts to catch up with the United States. The European Union demand falls by around 20% over the period to 2040. And that has a lot to do with the new efficiency and renewables targets that were agreed early this year. By 2040, total demand in the European Union overtaken by Africa. And that's despite the fact that per capita consumption in Africa remains the lowest in the world. And also the fact that in our projections, there remains hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa in particular that remain without access to modern energy. How do we meet this demand for this growing demand for energy in our projections? I'll start with the fuel that you can't see. In this scenario, we have a growth in overall energy demand of just over a quarter. Without improvements in energy efficiency, that would be around twice as much. But after that, the main event is really the rise in renewable technologies in particular. Renewables on their own, that meets 45% of the increase in global energy demand. In the power generation side, that's 2/3 of new capacity coming from renewables. And what it means in practice is that renewables and coal swap places in the power generation mix. Today, coal's around 40%, renewables are around 1/4. By 2040, renewables have moved up to 40% and coal has traced the opposite path. Turning to natural gas, strong increase in consumption in this scenario, driven by developing economies. We'll come back to the role of China here. But just to emphasize that the largest single increase, if we look at different sectors, doesn't come from the power generation sector, which is today's largest sector for gas consumption, but it comes from industry. Gas is well suited to provide not just heat for industrial consumption, but it's also fairly widely used as a feedstock for different chemicals. Moving on to oil. Oil demand in the transport sector, particularly in that the segment that's marked on the screen for cars, it is under attack, as it were, from fuel efficiency, from fuel switching. In these projections, oil use for cars actually peaks in the middle of the 2020s. But that's not the whole story. In fact, the oil demand continues to grow, albeit at an ever slower pace, all the way through to the end of our projection period. And that's because it's not just the story of cars, which is less than 1/4 of total oil demand, but it's also about trucks, it's also about aviation, shipping, and petrochemical feedstocks. And in all of those other areas, there is continued growth. Finally, coal. In advanced economies, coal is in structural decline, but there is some offsetting growth in India, in Southeast Asia. China is somewhat exceptional in that picture, in that it has a reasonably substantial fall in coal consumption between now and 2040. In fact, that fall in coal consumption is higher than the European Union's total coal use today. I'm going to say a few words on oil. I mentioned at the start that volatility is the new name of the game, but I wanted to talk a little bit about risks of a more lasting imbalance in markets that could emerge in the 2020s. Today, markets look comfortably supplied, but that picture might change tomorrow. First on the screen is the demand outlook. That's on average continued growth at around a rate of 1 million barrels per day per year to 2025. So slowing somewhat from the sorts of growth that we've seen in recent years, but still robust growth. The question we ask ourselves is, where is that supply coming from? And the task is not just to meet the increase in demand, but also to compensate from the declines that you have among currently producing fields. How do we fill that gap? Part of this green wedge, which includes all sources except US shale, is, so to speak, in the bank. Those are projects that are approved and that which will ramp up between now and the mid-2020s. We've also included in that an allowance for new project approvals, new conventional project approvals, at the rate that we've seen over the last few years. But the difficulty arises from the fact that the rate over the last few years for these types of conventional project approvals has actually been relatively low. It's been less than half of the rate that we had prior to the oil price fall that started in 2014. That means that we still have a very large gap that remains to 2025, and we have built in already very strong growth in US shale. But if we asked US shale to fill that entire gap, so if there's no pickup in conventional project approvals and demand stays where it is, and US shale is required to grow at that rate then output of tight liquids or from shale plays would need to grow to more than 20 million barrels a day. So that's adding more than 10 million barrels a day compared with today. In other words, US alone would need to add another Russia to global supply by 2025. With a sufficiently large resource base, larger than we have in the new policy scenario, this could be possible. However, it would require a level of capital investment and a number of tight oil rigs that would far surpass previous peaks. I'd like to say a few words also about natural gas. As you saw from the earlier slide, it does relatively well in our projections. I'd like to highlight a couple of significant changes in the consumption outlook since 2017, so since last year's edition. In the European Union, we've revised down our gas demand outlook for 2040 by some 50 billion cubic meters compared with last year. That's also related to the new renewables and efficiency targets. The impact on trade, which is the topic of this figure, is somewhat mitigated by the fact that we've also revised down the outlook for EU gas production. But the biggest change is in China, and that's an upward one. Gas is a good fit for China's policy preferences, including growing attention to the quality of growth and the needs of China's growing cities, including the need for improvements in air quality. We have some questions around the speed at which infrastructure, including storage, can be built out, but there are strong reasons to, there are strong underpinnings for our rapid growth alongside low carbon technologies. If we examine now what that means for traded gas, China by 2040 is importing around as much gas as the European Union. That's, in our view, a policy choice. It's a strategic choice made by China. We don't see the same policy support in other parts of other developing countries in Asia, and that's why you don't see quite the same dramatic effect across the board. And considering the implications then for long-distance gas trade, the split between pipeline and LNG, at the moment pipeline remains the preferred way to move gas over long distances, but since most of that increase in trade comes from LNG, then that pendulum swings across, and by 2040, LNG has overtaken pipeline gas as the preferred way to deliver gas over long distances. Up until recently, we were concerned at the dearth of new investment projects in LNG in particular, so in new liquefaction projects, but the market opportunity that seems to be visible in our projections, the companies have taken steps to fill it. The Qataris stepped in with a large announcement about further development of their large resource base. Now LNG Canada, US is also growing, and that eases any concerns that we might have had about the prospects for a tightened LNG balance in the mid-2020s. A few words on investment. Common denominator over the last couple of slides, discussion about the adequacy of investment. Obviously a crucial variable both for energy security and also the prospects to move the energy system onto a different path. Huge needs, somewhere close to 2 trillion a year on average in energy supply. Major investments also needed on the demand side, efficiency, electric vehicles, and so on. What I wanted to highlight here is the critical role of governments in determining where these investments go. Around 70% of that total investment in energy supply in this scenario either comes from state-directed enterprises or it responds directly to regulation put in place by governments that provides some full or partial revenue guarantee to the investor. So 70% of this investment lies directly in the hands of governments. Examples would be the auctions for new low-carbon investment, for investments in electricity grids or gas pipelines, biofuels, as well as all of the investments made by state-owned companies, including national oil and gas companies in the Middle East and elsewhere. Only a relatively small share involves private companies taking on full market risks from the oil price, say, or from wholesale electricity prices. What are the implications of that? It just means that the pathway that the energy system follows depends on choices made by governments and the policies that they implement. A rapid energy transition is not inevitable. It's a route that needs to be chosen. And as Brent will now discuss in relation to electricity, those kinds of policy considerations are also very central to our outlook for the reliability and sustainability of electricity supply.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'd just like to turn now to electricity, and which was the special focus for this year's World Energy Outlook. And there are three basic motivations for why it was the focus and why 2018 is the year of electricity here at the IEA. First, electricity is at the heart of modern societies and the new digital economy. Whether it's communications, medical services, food services, and increasingly transport, reliable supply of electricity is at the heart of those activities. The second motivation is investment in the power sector is large and growing. It surpassed that of oil and gas supply in the last 2 years. And looking forward, we project it to be nearly half of total energy supply investment to 2040, some $20 trillion in the power sector to 2040. So the third is the rise of wind and solar PV that's transforming electricity supply. And this has impacts on all fuels and is happening in all markets. So these are the motivations. The electricity focus itself spans demand and supply. And so it's too much to cover here. As mentioned, we'll also have an electricity webinar in the coming days, but I want to highlight a few elements here today. The first is a key theme on flexibility, that it will be the cornerstone of tomorrow's power systems. And this is a direct result of wind and solar fast becoming the technologies of choice. So flexibility has always been a part of electricity systems. In the past, it meant that supply was generally adjusting its output, large power plants adjusting output to match demand that was changing minute to minute, hour to hour. In the future, variability will also be coming from wind and solar, so on the supply side as well as the demand side. And this raises flexibility needs overall by some 80%, we estimate, over the next decade, some 4 times faster growth than electricity demand itself. So if we look at a few regions to get an idea of how this is changing, we look today, India, China, and the United States have shares of wind and solar PV below 8% in total annual generation. That's a level that requires mobilizing existing flexibility in power systems and relying mainly on power plants. So shares are higher than that today in some other countries, including Germany, which had a share of about 25% of generation coming from wind and solar in 2017. Denmark is another example with close to 50% coming from wind and solar. And at those levels, much more flexibility is needed, and regional trade in particular plays a more critical role. So when we look forward, we see current proposed policies leading to wind and solar PV booming, making up more than half of global capacity additions to 2040 in the new policy scenario. And that lifts their share of overall generation, so of annual supply of electricity, from just 6% in 2017 to over 20% in 2040. And that narrows the gap with coal, as Tim mentioned. Today, 38% of generation comes from coal. Globally, 6% from wind and solar. In the future, 26% from coal and 21% from wind and solar. So really closing the gap there. But the changes, we don't have to wait until 2040. The changes are coming sooner in many regions. If we look forward to 2030, the US, China, and India all move up to phase 3 here of integration, where targeted investment in flexibility is needed. In India, for example, enhancing flexibility of coal-fired power plants, upgrading regional interconnections, and deploying energy storage are all part of an effective flexibility package. The European Union goes further, reaching phase 4 of integration that we've defined here in the International Energy Agency through our various work on system integration. And this is a level where few countries are today, requiring all sources of flexibility, including waking the sleeping giant of demand-side response. Several countries within the European Union go further, including Germany and the United Kingdom, moving further up the flexibility ladder beyond where any large country is today. Not only does this have an impact on the flexibility needed in systems, it also has an impact on market designs, which will come under pressure from these changing conditions, particularly downward pressure on wholesale electricity prices. And with this call for flexibility rather than energy, which is historically the way power systems work, it may call for reforms to market design. The second point I'd like to talk about refers to the second largest low carbon source of electricity. That's nuclear power, where trends are more mixed. On the one hand, the world share of nuclear and electricity is on the decline, standing at 10% in 2017, and that's down from a peak of about 18% some 20 years ago. On the other hand, new construction has recently rebounded. 11 gigawatts came online so far in 2018, the highest total since 1990, and 40 gigawatts came online over the past 5 years, equal to the 14 years preceding that. So there is some momentum in recent years. If we look at the regional trends, we also see two directions for nuclear. Shown here, you see in advanced economies, nuclear provides close to 20% of electricity supply today, but the fleet is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, its 40th birthday on average in 2018, which also happens to be the original design lifetime for most of those projects. So while there are some new reactors under construction, the central question is how long will the existing fleet last? So to demonstrate the potential change coming, we considered nuclear in these three markets that have been longtime leaders in nuclear power, where the role of nuclear could decline substantially in 2040. Considering the lifetimes of those plants, the current lifetime extensions already granted, and the projects under construction, we would still see by 2040 the contribution declining substantially and falling to about 5% of generation in these economies. And losing that nuclear capacity would be a major challenge for both decarbonization and energy security. On the contrary, China emerges as the new global leader for nuclear. China built 70% of new nuclear capacity over the past 5 years, including 9 gigawatts connected to the grid so far in 2018, and it makes up a significant portion of capacity under construction. So by 2030, nuclear capacity in China overtakes that of the US. Russia, India, and several countries in the Middle East are set to expand their nuclear fleets in the coming years, further shifting that regional balance. The third point I'd like to highlight concerns electricity demand, and a question we asked ourselves of how fast electricity demand can grow. There are signs that policymakers are increasingly looking to electrify end uses and increase the use of electricity throughout the economy. Over the past decade, we've seen electricity demand increase at twice as fast as overall energy demand. And going forward, this relationship continues under the current proposed policies included in the new policy scenario. So we're going to get twice the rate of overall energy demand. But electricity demand can be influenced by government policies. On the one hand, you can reduce electricity demand growth by emphasizing energy efficiency, but you can also raise it through greater electrification of end uses. So expanding the digital economy has this push and pull effect where it can also offer efficiency gains while at the same time raising electricity consumption for new activities such as digital currencies and the supporting data centers. Other examples include China's clean winter heating plan that aims to see a switch from coal to electric or gas heating, and deployment of electric buses, which can be a major driver of electricity demand. This is also alongside ambitious electric vehicle targets elsewhere around the world. And beyond transport, new demand follows from providing access to electricity for the nearly 1 billion without it today. So this year, we introduced the Future as Electric scenario to examine some of these uncertainties. We asked ourselves, if all of the economic opportunities for electrification were exploited, how much would demand growth be, removing all non-economic barriers? In this case, we see a digital economy that connects all consumer devices and appliances. Electricity makes inroads in heating for buildings and transport, for buildings and industry, And also half of the global fleet goes electric by 2040 in this scenario, and full electricity access is achieved. So what happens to electricity demand in that case? We see that it increases substantially faster. By 2040, we have 7,000 terawatt hours more electricity demand, which is the equivalent of the United States and European Union today. Electricity, this taps about half of the overall technical potential of electricity in the global economy, reaching 31% of total final consumption, which is up dramatically from 19% today. And the switch to electricity also has an impact on demand for other fuels, especially oil. Oil demand peaks by 2030 and then declines, approaching today's level by 2040. At that point, oil demand for transport is the same as the level today, despite a near doubling of the global car fleet, and oil used in homes and factories for heat is reduced by more than 1/4 compared to the new policy scenario. As a result, total consumer spending on energy is nearly 10% lower, and actually spending on electricity would overtake that for oil products. Finally, electrification provides an avenue to reduce both carbon dioxide emissions and air pollutant emissions at the point of use, bringing with it significant health benefits. However, overall CO2 emissions could keep growing without stronger efforts to decarbonize electricity supply. So what we see here speaks to a particular belief at this point that electrifying end uses automatically decarbonizes the energy sector. And what we found through the analysis is that this is not necessarily the case because of a switch to other uses and increased emissions in the power sector. This is even with a substantial increase in terms of renewables and other low carbon sources. For example, renewables grow at twice the rate that we've seen in the last 5 years in the future electric scenario, but it's still not enough to curb CO2 emissions in the long run. And that leads me to my last point before I'll turn the floor back to Tim, is concerning the challenge of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. In particular, if we look at the new policy scenario, we see that energy-related CO2 emissions steadily increase to 2040, even with all the good news on renewables, energy efficiency, and electrification. So why are we struggling to make progress? One factor is the emissions that are linked to today's energy-using infrastructure. All the industrial boilers, power plants, buildings, and vehicles. This stock of equipment is slow to change, and in some cases lasting more than 70 years, which can effectively lock in a certain amount of CO2 emissions without direct intervention from policymakers. So we looked at how much is actually locked in effect by this infrastructure. A detailed analysis of all the existing infrastructure around the world revealed that some 500 gigatons of CO2, in fact, more than 500 gigatons of CO2, would be emitted if this equipment operated normally to 2040 and operated for its normal technical lifetime. To put this in context, to compare these emissions to the path laid out in our sustainable development scenario, we see that this infrastructure alone eats up close to 95% of all the CO2 emissions permitted. This explains why it's so difficult to bend the curve of emissions each year and sends a clear message. New investment in energy-using equipment needs to be low carbon wherever possible, and intervention in how we use existing infrastructure will be essential in meeting our climate goals. It also means that all opportunities to reduce emissions should be pursued. One such opportunity is on the fossil fuel supply side, specifically the emissions involved in bringing oil and gas to consumers. Not all sources of oil and gas are equal in their emissions impact, a topic that we looked at in detail in this World Energy Outlook. Other examples are tied to innovative technologies such as carbon capture, utilization and storage, and hydrogen. To take an example, coal-fired power plants account for 1/3 of energy-related CO2 emissions today. And due to their long lifetime and their young age, in fact, more than half are teenagers today, less than 15 years old, they could represent more than 1/3 of that cumulative locked-in emissions to 2040. This is something that, if steps weren't taken, would occur in these emissions, certainly would make the challenge of meeting climate goals more difficult. So in order to provide and enable some additional room to maneuver, policies and measures targeting the deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and limiting the lifetime of unabated coal-fired power plants must be taken. Let's also look at reducing operations at the remaining facilities, starting with the least efficient coal-fired power plants and those that have moved beyond their economic lifetime as a key means to increase that room to maneuver. So with that, I'll turn it back to Tim.
Thanks very much, Brent. Just to say, I can see that there are questions coming in on the browser. If you have questions about the presentation or any other aspect of the World Energy Outlook, then please send them in, and we'll do our best to cover them in the Q&A that follows. But before they're doing that, just a few concluding thoughts. One thing that we observe and that complicates the outlook is particularly the outlook for energy security are the links between energy and politics. These are never absent in the energy world, but in our view, they are strengthening and becoming more complex. On the oil side, when we look out into the 2020s, we do see a mismatch between what we project for demand in that main scenario and the amount of new project approvals, particularly on the conventional side. And we wanted to flag that warning in the World Energy Outlook. As Brent was saying, there are huge opportunities arising from the rapid growth of electricity. But it's not just about providing electricity. From a policymaker's perspective, increasingly, the test for the reliable operation of power systems will be the ability to deliver not just electricity, but also flexibility as the share of wind and solar PV in particular increase. Very important set of messages on energy-related CO2 emissions. The trend that I spoke about at the start that's emerging in the 2018 data, that does not turn around in our new policy scenario. And that creates two challenges, which I think Brent spoke about. It means you have to be very wary and careful about the technologies that you add to those that you have in the system already, but you also need to be much smarter about the way that you use today's stock of energy-using assets. And that's why we emphasize renewables efficiency, but also a host of innovative technologies, including CCUS, storage, hydrogen, as ways to turn that emissions trajectory around. And finally, some thoughts on the role of governments. You may recall the slide earlier, which looked at the share of investments that lie in the hands of governments, either through state-owned enterprises or because they're responding to some regulatory or incentive that's determined by regulation. In our view, the future pathway for energy remains open, but it's really governments that will determine where our energy destiny lies. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I'll turn things back over to Claudia, who's going to ask the questions that are coming in.
Thank you very much, Tim. So I think we can start with a question on bioenergy. What are your projections for bioenergy supply and demand?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Earlier this year, we released our new set of 5-year outlooks for renewables. And this year, the focus of that 5-year outlook was on bioenergy. I think they referred to bioenergy as the overlooked giant of renewables and indeed of the energy system as a whole. They made the point that although the focus in the debate is very much on solar PV, on wind, and indeed we strongly emphasized those in our projections. It's actually modern bioenergy is around half of all the renewables consumed at the moment. That's 4 times larger than the contribution of solar PV and wind together. In our projections, there are 2 trends that we need to be aware of. One is that the use of solid biomass as a cooking fuel in developing economies falls. It falls in our main scenario, but it falls dramatically in the sustainable development scenario. That is a good thing. It means that we are moving towards the wider availability of clean cooking facilities, which means we are also reducing the amount of premature deaths or the risks to particularly to women and children in many parts of the developing world. But the use of modern bioenergy in many economies increases. It increases for three reasons. One is that bioenergy in the power systems can be an important factor in some countries, and it can also be an important element of flexibility, the issue that Brent was talking about. Secondly, it's around the increase in the use of biofuels for mobility. The biofuels consumption in our main scenario more than doubles, and it goes up from today's around 2 million barrels a day to more than 7 million barrels a day in the sustainable development scenario. And finally, there is the issue of heat provision. Heat is around half of the world's final energy consumption. And bioenergy is by far the largest renewable source of heat, and that also increases. It increases very strongly in the sustainable development scenario. But the point that I wanted to emphasize here is the importance of robust sustainability frameworks. Only bioenergy that really reduces life cycle emissions and avoids unacceptable social, environmental, and economic impacts is going to be contributing to be part of the solution to the environmental challenges that we've talked about today.
Okay, so I think, Brent, a question on flexibility. More flexibility is needed, but what type, short or long term, and why would a new market design be needed to deliver this need?
Thanks very much for the question. Yeah, this is a critical element of this, is that there are, of course, flexibility is a broad umbrella term that refers to both within very short time frames in terms of seconds to possibly up to seasonal storage. So it depends on where you are in terms of those phases of integration that we talked about. So at the lower phases, say in phases 1 and 2, the flexibility you need is sort of what we are used to in power systems, where most is in terms of hour-to-hour changes, and of course you have very, very short time frames to really balance exactly to maintain the frequency in the matter of seconds. But it's not fundamentally different than what we have in power systems that have had based on the variation of demand. As you move up and the share of wind and solar in particular becomes higher, and what we're seeing also is that demand is becoming more concentrated at times of peak, moving forward to 2030 and beyond. That means that flexibility, we're going to not only need more of it on the short time scales, we'll also need possibly seasonal storage, particularly in the levels mentioned for Germany and the United Kingdom, where you may have a lot of demand in one season, a lot of supply that may not necessarily match up exactly. And so an element of seasonal storage there will be quite interesting. This is where some of the discussions around sector coupling, combining electricity and heat production, not only at the plant site, but in terms of uses, is increasingly under discussion, looking forward to those higher phases of integration and what you'll need. Now, the market design that would bring that forward is certainly a very interesting question, and something we tried to lay out as well and cover in this year's World Energy Outlook. But I would highlight that we feel that there may be need for market reforms. Now, in many cases, we're not far enough along to kind of have seen the market reforms being tested yet. But generally, energy is the main source of revenue, and that, in our analysis, would decline over time in terms of share of covering, or how much it covers of your total costs. So clearly, flexibility and other services, potentially adequacy services for the entire system, these will need to become a larger portion of your overall revenue package, the sort of revenue stack, if you like, for each technology. And if that's able to come forward from ancillary service markets the way they are more or less designed now, we see that those need to be bolstered really to provide the signals for that investment in flexibility.
Thank you very much. Now, few questions have come on methane emissions. If we can say anything, if we have any insights in 2018 on methane emissions, and also on analysis on lock-in from investment in gas and LNG infrastructure and risks associated with unmanaged methane emissions on both short term and long term.
Thanks very much for those set of questions. Indeed, we have emphasized in successive editions of the World Energy Outlook the risks arising from leaks of methane to the atmosphere along the oil and gas supply chains. Some of you may recall in the World Energy Outlook 2017, we put together a full analysis, a full set of estimates about the extent of these oil and gas methane emissions. Those are not the only methane emissions that are attributable to the energy sector. There are some from biomass, incomplete combustion of biomass. There are some also from coal, but we did focus on the issue of oil and gas methane. And what we did this year is we broadened our horizon somewhat and tried to put that in the context of all of the energy use and emissions that arise during the production and transportation and processing of oil and gas. So everything except the final combustion emissions. And what we found was, well, I think there's two big important findings there that I'd like to highlight. And the total emissions from oil and gas, greenhouse gas emissions, so CO2 and methane, that's some 15% of total energy sector greenhouse gas emissions. That is a significant number. The next important finding was that there is an extremely wide spectrum between the least emitting sources and the highest emitting sources. That ranges, but I mean, in general, there's a factor of 4 difference between, in a sense, the best performers and the worst. And what we found is that methane is really the critical element that determines where you end up in that spectrum. That highlights once again the importance of this issue. But I think it's also possible to see that as an opportunity, because in our view, there are technologies that can cost effectively bring down those methane emissions. What we did in the analysis last year was that we found that the value of that methane, if captured and sold, would cover, in the majority of cases, the cost of the abatement technology. And so I guess the message there is then that there are ways for policy to bring down those that category of energy sector greenhouse gas emissions. And we are continually emphasizing also to the gas industry that this is not only an opportunity, but in our view, it's also one of the variables that will really affect the future role of gas in the energy system.
Thank you very much, Tim. One question on oil use and consistency with the IPCC 1.5 report. You expect most cars will still be oil-fueled in 2040. How is it consistent with IPCC 1.5 requirements, which assume carbon neutrality after 2050?
I think this speaks to the difference between our new policy scenario and the outcomes in our sustainable development scenario. In the new policy scenario, the number of electric cars on the road expands very rapidly and reaches around 300 million in 2040. There's also a large expansion in the electric bus fleet. A lot of that is in China, in electric 2 or 3 wheelers. But for the reasons that I mentioned in the presentation, oil consumption continues to grow. In the sustainable development scenario, that kind of trajectory is not, I mean, it has to change. Oil use peaks for all sectors in the early 2020s and starts a rapid decline. So that by 2040, we are around 70 million barrels a day of oil consumption in that scenario. So I think the divergence there is clear, and it speaks to the need for stronger policies, both on the fuel efficiency side, but also on fuel switching. I mean, I spoke a bit earlier about the risk of a shortfall in new projects, and clearly that risk would be mitigated in a stronger, demand side policy environment. However, even in the sustainable development scenario, the rate at which your existing fields decline is still much greater than the rate at which demand declines. So even in that kind of scenario, there is still a call for some new investment and new projects coming through in order to ensure a least cost transition.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Next one is about electricity and gas security. What about the electricity and gas security of supply concerns, especially for the electric is future scenario?
Thanks very much for the question. So I think one key aspect here in terms of security is, of course, the agency as a whole has been looking to go beyond historically the foundation of the agency on oil security to also include gas security and now electricity security as well, and sort of equal parts, equal partners on this. And I think there's an element in the analysis I mentioned on flexibility. This also has implications then for gas security as well. So we're seeing that increasingly electricity and gas security are interlinked. There particularly we had some additional analysis this year on the energy union in the European Union, and you see there that the infrastructure needed for electricity and the infrastructure needed for gas supply are quite codependent, and that the actual use of those are very much dependent on the other. So, for example, electricity security in the European Union at certain times of the year will be very reliant on the reliable supply of gas. Now, there's also a pressure that with a rising share of wind and solar, that actually the amount of gas used at any given time on average will be lower than what we've seen historically. So in some ways you're more dependent on that infrastructure and at the same time using it less. That's also true in electricity, where particularly for networks, there is an issue around affordability, where it will be very important to plan systems in a coordinated way, not just for electricity, but also beyond for the systems that it affects. So this applies also in the future as electric scenario, but of course also in the new policy scenario and the sustainable development scenario. If we think just about the future as electric scenario and more being focused on electricity, there you see that actually, in terms of shares and overall use, this linkage is there, but it's not particularly strained in any way, where you see more challenges or the requirement for more coordinated efforts are at higher shares of wind and solar that we would see in the sustainable development scenario. So certainly this will be the investment challenges of this new wave and this new era in electricity supply. In that way, extends actually beyond the electricity sector itself, and also then affects supply and investment in gas infrastructure in those cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brent. Next question on petrochemicals. You said petrochemicals will be one of the largest sources of oil demand. Is that still true even if we recycle more and ban single-use plastics?
This is a question that has come up in relation to the World Energy Outlook, but also we produced an analysis on the future of chemicals earlier this year, and that was one of the main issues discussed there as well. Today, the global average rate for plastic recycling is around 15%. There's clearly a strong push in many countries to increase that rate. However, the countries where plastics consumption is surging are also countries where recycling rates are relatively low. So if we look at what happens in our new policy scenario, the net effect is that recycling rates creep higher, but there's no transformative impact at global level. In the sustainable development scenario, we have a much higher rate of average collection rates for recycling. In fact, they double in that scenario. So we get to somewhere around 35%. The impact on oil demand is to take around 1.5 million barrels a day off the growth in demand for oil as a petrochemical feedstock. So it reduces the growth, but it doesn't eliminate it. I don't think it's probably important to mention that when you look at a carbon constrained scenario like the Sustainable Development Scenario, you have to take into account also that the use of oil as a feedstock, that oil is not combusted. It's not associated with any direct emissions, although, as we discussed earlier, you need to pay close attention to the indirect emissions. So I think that's a relevant factor. The other question about single-use plastics, that could also make a dent in plastic demand. But I think we need to exert some care in how we think that through. The bags that you have in supermarkets, the single-use bags, they include around 10 times as much plastic as the multi-use bags consume around 10 times as much plastic as the single-use ones. The research shows thus far that they're not used sometimes they're used on average around 3 times, around 4 times. So a ban on single-use plastics doesn't necessarily, unless you change some behavioral elements, doesn't necessarily bring down demand very, very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. One question was on future of energy business. What would you think about the future of energy business? Can we consider a complete evolution as renewable prices are rapidly going down and the amount of prosumers are increasing? Do you think the conventional energy supply can change someday?
Yeah, thanks very much. And this is one of the central questions that we looked at as well in the electricity focus. It was one of the motivating questions was how are kind of the large-scale electricity business, how is that changing? What are some of the challenges, opportunities there? And certainly distributed energy sources are one of the key elements to consider. So we have, at the very large-scale, utility costs for solar PV and wind power declining rapidly and becoming increasingly competitive with other large-scale power plants, so more competitive with coal and gas-fired power plants over time. And we're seeing that's changing the business there, where the role for policymakers on the one hand is more of establishing enabling frameworks rather than providing actual financial support to change the dynamics there. A key element is, of course, that policymakers need to support a more rapid deployment of those technologies, of all low carbon technologies, to pursue those the Paris Agreement overall. The distributed side gains, particularly from when solar PV costs at the utility scale are falling, they're also driving down the costs on the distributed side. We're seeing energy storage costs also falling quite dramatically, and this combination is making it more and more attractive for consumers to provide their own electricity supply, selling back also to the grid. So what starts to matter, and what we're looking at very closely there, are the economics of those decisions. There will always be sort of the first movers who are willing to pay a premium, but ultimately these economics would drive sort of a large-scale adoption of this. And either policymakers can provide a push there, or ultimately the market can provide that. And that will largely depend on how electricity prices are actually charged, and how the structure of electricity prices. It's not something we often think about as consumers, but are you paying for your connection a significant amount, or are you just paying for the electricity delivered to you? And it's important to get that balance right, to reflect a little bit the costs in the system to some extent, in order not to transfer costs from one consumer to another. We want this transition and the uptake of distributed renewables and distributed energy sources in general to move in a positive direction for all consumers. And so to be part of the overall sustainable transition, part of that is that the economics of it are sustainable. And certainly that's becoming much more interesting in many more places. We see already many island systems, for example, moving to full, are very interested in moving to full renewables plus storage. And this is something we're watching closely going forward. So we do think that can have a big impact. And for the longer term, we do see that the utility scale business will remain the backbone of electricity supply in most regions. unless there is something that dramatically changes from where we're standing today, or a particular push there. Again, policymakers will help choose the path on where we go from here. We've highlighted the challenges for utilities to adapt to this changing environment, and that will also be not only from distributed, but also that energy will provide less revenues. Flexibility will be a bigger part of the revenue stream, and how all these factors interplay is a very interesting area to watch.
Thank you very much, Brent. One more question on IMO decision. Taking into consideration that IMO will change policy to cut sulfur emissions in nearest future, what will be the impact on petroleum market?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. This IMO change is set to be introduced in January 2020, so it is really in the nearest future. As you're all aware, we look out to 2040, so this is an issue where our colleagues in the oil markets team are also paying very close attention to this. But we have also looked at the implications of this. There's around 3 million barrels a day of high sulfur fuel oil used for maritime transport. The change in January 2020 is likely to lead to a drop of around 2 million barrels a day in the use of high sulfur fuel oil. And obviously the challenge for the market is to find compliant fuels or ways to remove the sulfur from that high sulfur fuel oil. In our view, the compliant fuels is going to be the predominant route to compliance in the initial phases. That means marine gas oil, which is essentially very close to diesel, or some form of low sulfur fuel oil. There's also the possibility that when some refiners are looking at developing a new low sulfur bunker fuel that blends existing high sulfur fuel oil with diesel. So there's a number of ways in which compliant fuels could find their way through. Another option is to install scrubbers, and that would allow you to continue to use high sulfur fuel oil but remove the sulfur on board before it's emitted to the atmosphere. It's unlikely, in our view, to be the main route for compliance, relatively capital intensive. Moving to LNG is another option, but in our view, that's likely to be relatively limited, at least in the short term. Expensive to convert ships to use LNG. Bunkering infrastructure is not, for the moment, extremely widely available. The implications for markets is that, this raises the prospect of a spike in diesel prices. We don't see that there will be sufficient diesel available to meet all of that surge in demand around 2020. That spike must slacken only as new fields are developed and scrubbers are installed across the maritime fleet. There's also an issue about what to do with the displaced high sulfur fuel oil. That's a major challenge for the refining industry. We're also looking in our own analysis at where that might end up in the system, possibility that it might be used also for power generation, even in systems like the Middle East, where solar PV offer an extremely cost-competitive option for generation. So those are some of the factors that play into this. If you want to have a look at the numbers, then there's analysis also from the oil markets team as well as in our World Energy Outlook.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think we are out of time, so we might have to stop here. Thank you very much to all of you for listening and for all your questions. There are a few that we did not manage to reply. We will try to get back to you via email as soon as possible. Thanks.